The clock in the office lobby struck 11 p.m. The sound carried across the vast, empty atrium. Bouncing off the polished marble floors, Michael pushed his heavy cleaning cart through the glass doors. Each rotation of the wheels produced a sharp, rhythmic squeak that echoed into the rafters. He stopped for a second, listening to the silence that rushed back in to fill the space. No one else was there. No footsteps. No voices. Only the hum of the ventilation system and the weight of his own equipment. He adjusted his grip on the cold metal handle of the cart and pushed forward. His movements were precise, practiced over countless nights. He steered the cart toward the center of the lobby, the wheels leaving faint temporary streaks on the floor. He knew every corner of this building. He knew how the lights flickered in the hallway and how the air grew colder near the elevators at this hour. He did not look at the security cameras mounted in the corners. He simply kept moving, his pace steady and unhurried. The lobby was his starting point. He checked the brakes on the cart, pushed them down until they clicked, and prepared to begin the night's work. He reached the executive wing, where the carpet grew thick and the silence felt heavier. He pushed the cart over the threshold, the wheels muffled now, turning from a sharp squeak to a dull thud. He moved to the first desk, a sprawling expanse of mahogany. He emptied the small wastebasket, lifting it with practiced ease, and wiped a single coffee ring from the surface. A stack of confidential documents sat nearby, untouched, invisible to him in his role. He moved to the cubicle rows next. Here, the air felt stale, trapped between fabric partitions. He emptied dozens of bins in a rhythmic loop, his movements efficient, leaving no trace behind. He was a ghost in their high-power machine. He picked up a discarded designer coffee cup, tossed it into his bag, and stepped to the next row without breaking stride. He knew the habits of the people who sat here by the trash they left behind, who skipped lunch, who worked late, who drank too much soda. He collected their debris and vanished back into the hallway. The cycle was relentless. A quiet labor performed while the city above him slept. He did not mind the anonymity. In the quiet, he felt the steady rhythm of a man who owned his own time. The office lights flickered, but Michael was already somewhere else. 25 years ago, the air had been different. It smelled of aging paper and dust in a dim, quiet library. He sat at a small wooden desk, his fingers tracing the edges of a worn book cover. The room was empty, save for the soft sound of pages turning in the distance. He looked down at the text, his eyes locking onto a single sentence. Riches often come not from dramatic events, but from disciplined actions repeated consistently over long periods of time. He read the words once, then again. The weight of the statement settled into his mind, clearer than any lecture he had ever heard. He closed the book, the sound of the cover hitting the table sharp in the stillness. He looked up at the library ceiling, the realization forming like a physical pressure behind his eyes. He had been waiting for a miracle, for a sudden change in fortune, but the book offered a different path. It was not about luck. It was about the slow, grinding work of the long game. He stood up, pushed the chair back against the floor, and walked toward the exit. He knew exactly what he had to do. The street air was cold, biting against his skin, but Michael hardly noticed. He walked with a new, rigid purpose, his stride shorter and faster than before. He reached the bank just as the lights were dimming for the evening. The teller looked up, her expression tired, clearly ready to lock the doors. He stepped forward and placed his modest savings on the counter. The metal coins clinked against the cold glass, a sound that seemed too small for the ambition it represented. The teller glanced at the pile, then at him, her eyebrows lifting with a hint of doubt. She asked if he was sure he wanted to open an account with such a minor sum. Michael did not hesitate. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the ledger she pushed toward him. He signed his name, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. That single act of opening the account felt like slamming a heavy bolt into place. He walked out into the night, the bank receipt folded tightly in his palm. It was not much, just a few pages and a promise, but it was the first brick in a wall he would build for 2 decades. He felt the weight of the future in his hand, a quiet, growing gravity that shifted his entire world. The rhythm of the years took hold, transforming the act of saving into a pulse that beat beneath his daily life. Every shift began with the same pull of the heavy cart, the wheels grinding over the same floor patterns, but his focus had shifted inward. He performed the cleaning tasks with mechanical precision, his hands moving with efficient, practiced grace. Each paycheck arrived, and before he spent a cent on himself, he moved a calculated portion into his portfolio. It was a private ritual, invisible to the world. He started to track the numbers, watching them climb with the slow, inevitable force of a rising tide. There was a secret pleasure in the quiet accumulation, a sense of foundation being poured deep into the earth. He felt the shift in his own capacity, a hardening of resolve that came from knowing the money was working while he slept. He did not need the validation of others. The act of transferring those funds became his primary satisfaction, a tangible reinforcement of his commitment to the long game. The balance grew, a hidden architecture of his own making. And with every passing month, the future felt less like a dream and more like a mathematical certainty he was constructing, layer by layer, in the dark. The parking lot gleamed under the streetlights, a parade of polished metal and aggressive design. Michael steered his hatchback into the furthest corner, the engine rattling against the silence of the night. It was an old machine, scarred by years of use, yet it started every single time. He stepped out just as a group of coworkers emerged from the lobby, laughing. They swarmed around a brand new sedan, tapping the hood, their voices rising in excitement over the purchase. One of them caught Michael's eye, gesturing toward the gleaming vehicle, then pointed a mocking finger at the dented door of Michael's car. A heavy silence hung in the air, a social test designed to make him feel the sting of his own frugality. They waited for his embarrassment, for the apology of a man who could not keep pace. Michael simply gripped his keys, offered a polite, thin-lipped nod, and began his walk to the doors. He felt no urge to defend his choice. He knew the cost of their shiny exterior, a debt that would tether them to their desks for years to come. He kept his stride steady, his gaze fixed on the entrance, leaving the laughter behind him in the cool, dark air of the lot. Inside the break room, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the noise of a dozen animated conversations. His coworkers were huddled around a tablet, scrolling through vibrant images of sun-drenched beaches and expensive resorts. They described the luxury of their recent travels with frantic energy, their voices echoing off the linoleum walls. One of them leaned back, coffee mug in hand, and turned to Michael with a wide, challenging grin. "You really should join us next time, Michael. Stop living like a hermit and see the world while you still have the energy." They waited, expecting him to join the chorus of complaints about how much the trip had cost them. Michael stood by the vending machine, his hand resting on the cool metal. He visualized his portfolio, the quiet accumulation of wealth that was currently compounding in the dark. He saw their vacation as a tether, a week of indulgence paid for with months of future labor. He smiled, a genuine private expression, and shook his head. "I prefer my own company," he said, his voice steady. He turned away to continue his shift, feeling a sharp, clear sense of power. While they spent their futures on a few days of sand and surf, he was buying his own freedom, one quiet deposit at a time. Michael viewed his investment account not as a cold ledger of numbers, but as a silent, tireless partner. While he pushed his cart through the silent corridors, he imagined this partner working in the world beyond the office walls. It was a companion that never slept Tyria, never grew tired, and never took a vacation. When the financial news flickered on the lobby monitors, broadcasting reports of market volatility, other employees would stop and stare, their faces etched with anxiety. Michael would simply glance at the red tickers and feel a strange, calm satisfaction. He understood the mechanism. When the market dipped, his partner was busy buying low, stacking assets while the world panicked. It was a 24-hour cycle of relentless progress. He felt the weight of his cart, but it no longer felt like a burden of labor. It was merely the physical accompaniment to the work his portfolio was performing elsewhere. He realized that this partnership provided a level of security that no salary could match. It was a constant, steady presence that stood between him and the uncertainty of the future. He walked past the glass doors, feeling the quiet hum of his wealth growing in the dark, a loyal force operating in perfect synchronization with his long-term goals. The office was a graveyard of abandoned tasks and silence. Michael moved his cart through the shadows, his rhythm methodical and undisturbed. He knew the truth of his life was hidden from those who walked these floors during the day. His wealth was like a seed buried deep beneath frozen soil. There was no sprout to be seen, no leaves to show the world, Yet the biological process of growth was relentless. He stood in the center of the executive suite, the moonlight cutting sharp lines across the floor. He knew that beneath the surface of his mundane existence, a massive, complex structure was taking root. It was a reality that defied his surroundings. While his colleagues chased the validation of the present, he was building an empire in the dark. A deep sense of peace settled in his chest, anchoring him. He realized that the discrepancy between his outward appearance and his actual life was not a burden, but a shield. He did not need the world to see the roots he had planted. The knowledge of their depth was enough. He gripped the handle of his cart, feeling the weight of his purpose, and continued his work, perfectly content in the silence of his secret progression. By his 40th year, the scale of Michael's life had fundamentally shifted. He entered the executive suite, a space that once felt intimidating, and saw it with new eyes. A manager had left a private financial summary face up on a mahogany desk. Michael paused, his cloth in hand, and glanced at the figures. He did not need to calculate the difference. He knew his own net worth by heart. The numbers on the page were lower than his own. He stood in the silence of the office, the realization landing with the weight of absolute clarity. He had won the game they were all still playing. He looked at the leather chairs, the view of the city skyline, and the status symbols that defined their careers. All of it was built on a foundation of debt and performance. His own foundation was built on 2 decades of discipline. A surge of quiet, sharp triumph rose within him. He did not feel anger or a need to boast. Instead, he felt a profound sense of detachment. He wiped the desk clean, his movements precise and unhurried. He was the one who held the real power, hidden in plain sight, and for the first time, he walked out of the executive wing knowing exactly who he was. Michael pushed through the doors to the lobby, and the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, quiet scent of nighttime office work. The wall of monitors, usually set to muted news feeds, now pulsed with aggressive, flashing red banners. Emergency. Market crash. Dow plummets. The ticker tapes were screaming. He saw the numbers free-falling, jagged lines plunging towards zero. The silence of the night was shattered by the rapid-fire updates from the news anchors, their voices strained and urgent. He stopped his cart, his hands resting on the cold steel handle. He looked at the screens, reading the data. Investors were liquidating, frantically dumping assets in a race to the bottom. The lobby felt smaller, tighter, as the digital panic spilled out from the pixels. People who had been complacent only hours ago were now staring at their devices, their faces pale in the harsh glow of the red warnings. It was the test he had prepared for across 2 decades of consistency. The market was stripping away the weak, and the noise of the collapse was deafening. Michael watched the red flicker across the walls, his breathing slow and measured, standing motionless while the world around him began to tremble. The lobby became a theater of desperation. Men and women huddled in corners, their thumbs flying across mobile screens to dump portfolios before the slide worsened. One junior analyst slumped against a marble pillar, his face ghostly in the light of the plummeting charts. He kept whispering, "Sell it all. Just get me out." The air grew thick with the frantic energy of people watching their perceived futures dissolve into digital dust. Michael stood by his cart, the only still point in a room vibrating with anxiety. He watched the numbers continue their downward trajectory. Each percentage point shaved off represented a collective surrender to fear. The weight of the moment was palpable, a heavy pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. He felt the gravity of the situation, the total collapse of confidence that others were succumbing to. Yet, his own hands remained steady on the cart. He observed the wreckage of their strategies, the impulsive decisions driven by the red warning lights, and the sheer speed at which panic dismantled years of progress. He remained anchored, a silent observer at the center of the storm, waiting for the exact moment the market would reveal its true opportunity. The panic hit its peak. A nearby executive dropped his phone, the screen shattering against the polished floor, his breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. Michael did not look away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own device. The screen glowed with the same red warnings of economic ruin, but his thumb moved with the rhythm of a heartbeat. He opened his brokerage app. The interface was a sea of crimson, showing assets plummeting toward historical lows. Most would see this as a house on fire, He saw it as an invitation. He began to input his buy orders. First 1,000, then 2, then 5. Each tap was deliberate, devoid of the hesitation that paralyzed the men around him. He wasn't trading on emotion. He was executing a contract with his future self. He watched the confirmation windows pop up, one after another, locking in his positions while the rest of the world scrambled for the exit. He felt no adrenaline, only the quiet satisfaction of a plan moving exactly as calculated. As he hit the final confirm button, the screen went dark. He slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unchanged, and reached for the handle of his cart. The risk was absolute, but the conviction was ironclad. The recovery did not arrive with a whisper. It hit the financial wires like a physical shockwave. Within days, the red charts that had defined the landscape turned a vibrant, aggressive green. The panic that had paralyzed the office floor evaporated, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched chatter as those who had sold their holdings watched the numbers climb back toward the heavens. Michael continued his nightly rounds, the squeak of his cartwheels the only constant in the shifting environment. He did not check his phone during his shift. He did not need to. He felt the shift in the air, the collective realization that the market had roared back with a vengeance. His account, once a modest accumulation of disciplined deposits, began to swell with a momentum of its own. Every movement in the market now acted as a multiplier, turning years of quiet, steady contributions into a compounding force that surged ahead of the analysts and the day traders. The gap between his savings and the capital of those he worked for began to close, then vanished entirely. He walked past the executive offices, his hands steady on the metal handle of his cart, watching the reflection of the lobby lights against the glass. He had played the long game, and the board had finally tilted in his favor. The growth was no longer linear. It had moved into a vertical climb, the kind of acceleration that defied the steady, predictable pace of his previous decades. Michael stood in the middle of the empty lobby, the silence of the building contrasting with the violent, upward surge of his portfolio. He checked his tablet, his eyes scanning the data streams. The numbers were not just climbing, they were compounding, feeding on their own mass like an avalanche gathering speed down a mountainside. It was the moment he had waited for since that night in the library, 25 years ago. The seed he had planted in the dark had finally pushed through the surface of the soil, exposing itself to the light with an intensity that rendered his old life unrecognizable. He watched the digits tick over, faster than he could track, a relentless momentum that turned his quiet labor into a financial engine of massive scale. He realized then that the cycle of his routine had not just been a way to earn a living. It had been the forge that tempered his resolve. The weight of his past discipline was now yielding a future he had only theorized. He locked the tablet screen, his breath steady, knowing the trajectory of his entire existence had permanently shifted. The lobby remained empty, the only sound the faint hum of the climate control system. Michael stood near the polished marble reception desk, his tablet screen glowing in the dim light. A single notification blinked at the top of the display. He tapped the icon, his thumb steady. The balance column flickered, recalculated, and settled on a 7-figure sum. He stared at the digits. $1 million. The reality of the number did not strike him with fanfare or shouting. It arrived as a heavy, grounding pressure in his chest. He looked around the lobby, the familiar space suddenly appearing different, as if the air itself had changed composition. He leaned his weight against the metal frame of his cart, his hands gripping the handle until his knuckles turned white. This was the target he had chased through a quarter-century of nights. The goal was no longer a theory or a projection. It was a completed fact. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling the tension of 25 years of discipline finally begin to dissipate. He did not need to tell anyone. He did not need to change his posture. The validation was entirely internal, a quiet, absolute certainty that took root as he watched the lobby lights reflect in the dark glass doors. He had arrived at the summit he had built brick by brick. Michael pushed the cart forward. The squeak of the rubber wheels was the only sound in the hallway. He reached the executive suite, the carpeted floors thick under his boots. He stopped at the first desk, pulled a liner from the bin, and replaced it with precise, practiced movements. His hands did not tremble. He reached for a discarded paper cup, his fingers brushing the rim, and dropped it into the waste bag. The irony was a cold, sharp blade in his mind. He was the wealthiest person in the building, yet he was currently emptying its trash. He wiped the desk's surface, watching the polish catch the artificial light. He did not rush. He did not skip a single corner. He worked with the same rigorous efficiency that had built his wealth, treating the mundane task with absolute respect. He moved to the next office, vacuuming the perimeter with rhythmic, overlapping passes. Every action was a testament to the discipline that defined him. He was not finished because he was wealthy. He was finished because he had a job to do. He pulled the vacuum cord, coiled it with steady hands, and walked to the final row of desks, fully present in the labor he had mastered over 2 decades. Michael walked to the supply closet at the end of the hall. His footsteps sounded flat and final against the linoleum. He pushed the door open, the hinges giving a familiar, dry protest. Inside, the shelves were organized with the same military precision he applied to his portfolio. He placed the mop handle in its designated slot, the wood clicking against the metal bracket. He gathered his cleaning agents, wiping the bottles clean before setting them on the shelf. Each movement was deliberate, a closing chapter written in physical action. He stepped back and reached for the light switch, his hand hovering for a second before he snapped it off. The darkness rushed into the small space. He pulled the door shut, the frame catching with a soft thud. He inserted the key into the lock and twisted. The mechanism gave a sharp, definitive click that echoed down the empty corridor. It was a sound of absolute completion. He kept his hand on the key for a moment, feeling the cold metal, acknowledging the weight of the last 25 years. He released the key and let his arm drop to his side. The labor was done. The cycle was broken. He turned his back on the closet, his breathing slow and steady, ready to walk out of the building as a man who owned his own time. Michael pushed the heavy glass doors outward, stepping into the cooling night air. The city hummed in the distance, a stark contrast to the silence he had just left behind. He walked across the asphalt of the parking lot, his pace steady, measured, and unhurried. He stopped beside his hatchback. He placed his palms against the cool metal of the roof, his fingers finding the familiar dents he had lived with for years. He turned around. The skyscraper towered above him, a monolithic grid of darkened windows and steel. It looked smaller from this distance. He stared at the upper floors, tracing the path of the offices he had cleaned for a quarter of a century. The building held no power over him now. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and steady. He realized then that the millions in his account were merely a byproduct. The true wealth was the internal architecture he had constructed over 25 years of unrelenting discipline. He had forged a version of himself that could withstand the noise of the market and the pressure of conformity. He felt the weight of that character, a solid, immovable foundation. The money was just numbers, but the patience, the consistency, and the quiet resolve were his to keep forever. Michael pulled the handle and the door creaked open. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar texture of the upholstery grounding him. He inserted the key into the ignition. He did not rush. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life, a low hum that vibrated through the frame of the car. He shifted into gear, his movements fluid and practiced. He released the parking brake and pressed the pedal. The car rolled forward, crunching over loose gravel before hitting the smooth exit road of the lot. He pulled onto the main street, the city lights blurring into long streaks of color against the windshield. He did not look back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, navigating the quiet streets with a steady hand. He was an invisible millionaire moving through the night, blending into the flow of traffic without drawing a single glance. He had played the long game, resisting the urge for instant gratification, and the result was total freedom. As he turned the final corner, the skyscraper vanished from his rearview mirror. He accelerated, leaving the empty halls and the old routine behind, moving toward a horizon he had built, one day at a time, for 25 years.